Hi, everyone. I'm Ivo Dalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, a weekly review of the world's top stories. Joining us today is Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker. Great to see you again, Susan.
Thanks, Ivo.
Also with us is Prashant Rao, who's the international editor of The Atlantic, joining us for the first time from London. Prashant, wonderful to have you.
Thanks for having me.
And Matt Kaminsky, editor-in-chief of Politico, joining from Washington. Matt, great to have you back.
Be back.
Well, we're starting off with some breaking news and some sad news. The passing of Brent Scowcroft, General Brent Scowcroft, the only person to have been National Security Advisor twice and in two different administrations, for Jerry Ford and for George H.W. Bush, a giant in national security affairs. Every national security advisor since Brent Scowcroft has said that they want to be like Brent Scowcroft. Unfortunately, there's only one Brent Scowcroft, and now at age of 95, he's passed from natural causes, apparently. Susan, you've just finished a book with Peter Baker on James Baker, on the man who runs Washington. I believe is the title, coming out September 29th. As a result, you've studied and known and talked to Brent Scowcroft, perhaps more than any of us here. What's your reaction and your thoughts at this time?
Well, thank you, Ivo. And of course, you also literally wrote the book on what it's like to be on the National Security Council, which I highly recommend to everybody. Look, Brent Scowcroft, as you said, has been called the gold standard of national security advisors by basically everyone for the last 30 years. Now, of course, his model of how to run the national security process was often invoked, but rarely actually followed. It's become almost comical in a way to listen to various iterations of the ever-changing Trump administration say, oh, well, yeah, we think the Scowcroft model is the one that we're really going to implement now that the president is on the fourth national security advisor of his term, which is a record, I think, in that position. Look, Scowcroft he fused with George H.W. Bush in a way that made them extremely and uniquely effective at a moment when, the world was really in tumult. The end of the Cold War and the rise and the beginnings of the sort of post-Cold War order that we're still seeing, arguably we're seeing it's unraveling today. That was a product of the Scowcroft Bush administration. It's not an accident that after Bush office, the foreign policy memoir he co-wrote with Brent Scowcroft and not with Jim Baker. In many ways, Baker had transcended. He was the Secretary of State and he was George Bush's best friend all the way back to their days as doubles partners at the Houston Country Club. But he had sort of transcended and wished to transcend his role as a staffer and as a fixer. And he wanted to be a principal, in that Washington term, principal in his own right. And he was traveling around the world. So it was actually Brent Scowcroft who was the real day in and day out partner with George H.W. Bush in sort of taking the Cold War to a soft landing. He was a very cautious man, which fitted being with a very cautious president. There was no spiking the football when the wall came down, as Bush memorably said. And that, I think, fit Scowcroft. Many people remember him today for his decision to break with George W. Bush over the Persian Gulf War redux. And the invasion of Iraq was something that Scowcroft publicly opposed in an op-ed that really, really hacked off the second President Bush. It caused a rupture with his dad's closest advisor. And, the truth is that all of his father's closest advisors were, to varying degrees, extremely concerned and unsettled by the decision to preemptively invade Iraq. But only Scowcroft really drew the ire of President Bush. At any rate, it's a remarkable record for somebody who's so little known. I think it tells you a lot about his personality and the kind of model of a Washington staffer that he thought was appropriate.
Matt, any additional reflections on Brent? A story that sticks in your mind that sort of typified him?
mean, he does speak to me to a different era in American foreign policy, obviously, and it's. I guess the great irony, as Susan mentioned, is that his break was with the son of the man that he was closest to, and it was obviously George W. Bush that where Republican foreign policy kind of went from that kind of Bush senior model of a very kind of calculated pragmatism to either one driven more by idealism of the neoconservatives or currently the more the sort of personal whims of the current president, and we're left with no process at all. So you couldn't sort of think of more of an era which is more diametrically opposed to what Scowcroft represented for his whole career in Washington.
Prashant, any thoughts?
I mean, Susan really eloquently put everything across, to be honest. I've been reading John Bolton's book where he talks about how the Scowcroft NSC is the one to aspire to. And it is just remarkable that, somebody can sort of say that explicitly, and yet we have the national security process that we have at the moment, despite that open acknowledgement of what to aspire to.
No, I think that's the case. It's this, as Susan said, this idea that every national security advisor has wanted to model themselves on Scowcroft, and few have succeeded. In fact, not sure that anybody really understood the model, which is a different era. But as all of you said, a man of a specific era, and that era is coming to an end, and the generations are passing. Let's move on to some of the other bigger stories in the news. Prashant, let's start with Lebanon. A huge, extraordinary explosion in Lebanon, killing now, what is it, 145 people and 5,000 or so wounded. What is the impact of this extraordinary event, which, in the age of video, we actually saw and almost experienced almost anywhere in the world, that on a country that was already in deep trouble itself?
I mean, there have been a couple things that I've been thinking about with Lebanon that have kind of stayed with me. I remember years ago, a diplomat I spoke to told me, and trying to explain a story away, that whenever you think there's a tension between conspiracy and cock-up, it's more often than not cock-up. That is often a way to explain away poor decision-making and things like that. But it also speaks to the fact that, I think we too often think of, oh, there's no conspiracy here, so there's nothing to see. In fact, Lebanon shows us that just malice need not be required for the enormity of tragedy to be involved. In fact, this kind of shows the poor decision-making, the kind of the costs of inertia, the costs of just things sort of staying the same and sort of aspiring towards stability as the kind of end goal. In fact, in Lebanon, that has been the kind of attempted end goal for decades now. And stability has its own costs, in that sense of, no one was held accountable for years. This is symptomatic of a system that was, at the best of times, barely getting by. I personally saw this when I was in Iraq. I thought like Iraq was basically in many ways a mini Lebanon, in which no one was ever held accountable for small mistakes, let alone the larger ones, as time went along among Iraqi politicians. And the same is true in Lebanon. And I fear the same will be true again. I think one of the interesting things has been, I believe it was, it might have been actually Politico's China newsletter recently, which spotlighted how in the Tianjin blast of 2015, how many people were held to account publicly over the Tianjin explosion at the Tianjin port, which was also caught on video, which was also an enormous tragedy in which many people died. This is a point at which we can hold the kind of journalistic cliche, hold a mirror up to the society. And yet I think what we will see will be extremely disappointing to us as time goes on.
Susan, there was an arresting piece in the New York Times this morning by a journalist translator, reminding her that when she was 10 years old in 1989, at the final end of the Civil War, Michel Aoun was the leader of the militias and destroying parts of West Beirut. And now, of course, he's president, making the point that plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose in Lebanon in some way, and we're being exposed by that.
Well, that's right. Those images, I think, of the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who flew all the way to Beirut of solidarity, meant to be a show of solidarity with the Lebanese people, and yet they're mobbed by upset, distraught people who felt that, you know, he had showed up in the of their crisis, but their own government had not. You see, just generally, right at this moment, the sort of crisis of elites versus people, and that's led in many ways to a lot of the populists that you see in parts of Europe are somehow our octogenarian had come to office as a would-be tribune of people very, very like him. And it's an accident like this that brings it into clarity. How many people were paying attention to that? I noticed this the other day before this blast, striking pieces saying that Lebanon is literally collapsing. And, people didn't pay attention. And then boom, and all of a sudden people are shocked to discover, that this country's falling apart. The bottom line is that we've accepted, in effect, unacceptable status quos in so many places. And it's the unraveling of that order and the absence of leadership or even institutions that work. I think that is a striking facet of the international system at this moment. And just, to connect it to Scowcroft, he was against the US invasion of Iraq. But the truth is that he and Bush and Baker were very much in favor of the idea of American leadership. In fact, they assumed it. And what they would not have found comprehensible and would have been most distressed by was that this is a moment, in effect, with a complete vacuum of leadership in the world. And I think that, it's early days yet, but I fear that will come to be seen as one of the sort of notable characteristics of this era. The truth is, we talk a lot about rising great power competition with Russia and China, but they don't, at best, they're still sniping, at the sort of distressed and beleaguered superpower that the United States once was. And so to me, this is just, it's just a terrible sort of tragedy of a marooned people.
Matt, we're seeing in front of us a failed state. Literally, it failed, and I guess the blast itself, as Prashant said, is manifestation of its failure. Is this a moment that things wake up? Is it a moment we'll pay attention? This is the last time that in World Review we'll talk about Lebanon because it happens to be in the news, or do you see an opportunity here for the Paris of the Middle East, as it used to be called, to come back? How do you see it?
I fear the next time we talk about Lebanon, we will also not be for a good reason. I mean, there's a reason that Lebanon's an unsolved problem for the last 45 years, and it really is just a bit like Afghanistan, which also its problems date back to the same period in history from the 70s. That the what's been cobbled together is not tenable, and yet there is no better solution, at least that's apparent to the construct they have there now. I think Prashant's point about sort of governance can't be understated, and it applies to Iraq. There's a very good piece by Bobby Worth for the New York Times Magazine over the weekend that, we kind of explain problems in the Middle East, especially through the prism of, religion or history, but corruption is actually the sort of first, second, and third explanation for why things are not working well. The same applies to Russia too. We talk a lot about Vladimir Putin's nationalism, his great power ambitions, his nuclear arms, but actually for the last 20 years, it is corruption that has defined, and frankly, in the Soviet period too, but it's been much more overt, the sort of failures of Russia and many other countries that fall somewhere in that spectrum of failed state comes back to the failure of governance. When politicians misrule, this is unfortunately, and this is the most dramatic manifestation of it, but when politicians misrule, we are left with states just don't function. And that's something that we really don't talk, I think, enough about in sort of various contexts across the world.
Susan, it's a good transition to talking about Russia, that, as Matt mentioned, where We are seeing, in some ways, not just a protest that is happening 4,000 miles away from Washington, Moscow, further from Washington, for a specific case. But you do have this sense that things are not, that Putin doesn't have quite the same level of control, and that people are saying enough is enough. This corruption and this power hunger may lead them to a different direction. How do you see it? You know this country better than anyone.
Well, look, I mean, so we're 20 years in, amazingly enough, to Vladimir Putin's tenure. And you do have these kind of extraordinary protests. I'm sure people who are listening to this have seen some of the footage all the way thousands of miles across Russia from Moscow in Khabarovsk. You've seen, you know, their leaderless protests. It's a crisis that was triggered actually when the very popular elected leader of the region, who many people believe was more popular than Vladimir Putin himself, in a very heavy-handed move by the Kremlin, was arrested and removed from office. Putin seemed to take it very personally how much this region had turned against him. In fact, he even had moved in December the capital of the Far East region from Khabarovsk to Vladivostok, you know, in literally an act of spite against the city. Now, you know, what's striking about it is that, you know, generally speaking, you know, the idea has been that Russians as creation. They have accepted, even if unhappily, sort of the compact of the Putin era, which was always billed to them as sort of a trade of freedom for stability and more or less rising, if not skyrocketing, economic tide. But that has sort of, that social contract of the Putin era has sort of come crashing down in recent years. Obviously, oil prices aren't what they used to be. There's ongoing sanctions that have isolated Russia economically from the rest of the world because of its takeover and illegal annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. You also have the coronavirus and a sense of this all-pervasive toxic corruption that Matt talked about, you know, which had always accentuated the gap between the Russian people and their government. And that, I think, is what's all part of the stew here right now in the Far East. And then add to it, Putin has just extended through constitutional referendum, essentially made it possible for himself to serve for life as Russia's leader. And, you know, he had to postpone the referendum that made that official because of the coronavirus, but they went ahead with it anyways in July. And I think that that is, you know, a recognition, especially from a younger generation that's never known a leader of Russia, except for Vladimir Putin. Imagine that. Never known anyone else. Putin is already the longest serving leader of Russia since Joseph Stalin. And by the way, he's only in his not even quite late 60s. He's 67 years old. So he could be, he could break Stalin's record, and he could be in power for a very, very long time indeed. So I wouldn't say this is, you know, any kind of definitive reckoning for Putin, but it suggests a hollowness that is well worth watching.
So Matt, if you accept that very persuasive analysis, it suggests that you get one or the other, right? You get more protest or more repression in order to deal with it. How do you see it?
Well, I mean, the sort of Tsars seemed like they would last forever, and so did the Soviet Union. So eventually that famous Russian patience does run out. But I think it's really important to remember that the top priority of the Putin regime has been, for the last 20 years, regime survival. And he has, I think Facebook in some ways sort of stole some of his tactics in that you identify any potential rival before they become even something that will be a serious competitor to you. And you organize the machinery of government, including the security services, around snuffing out even a spark wherever it it comes. And he's been very, very effective at this. There has been moments where the regime has seemed to wobble. It was around 2011, 2012, where there was a sort of change in power, where there was a middle class in Moscow that rose up, and that was put down. It was put down quite brutally by the standards of at least post-Soviet Russia. You know, I mean, the middle class really felt the pain and didn't dare rise up again. What's interesting about Khabarovsk is that the state security services are really standing back. They're not going in. They're letting these protests take place and really just hoping that the kind of steam goes out of it. But this keeps coming up. There are a few, not that long ago, the pensioners rose up because their pensions were being cut. There is clearly a ripple of discontent throughout Russian society. And at some point, it will present an existential danger to Putin. But he knows that better than we do. And so I think he's just really, you know, that is the thing that he worries about in the morning and the thing that he worries about going to bed at night. And that's why I agree with Susan that you shouldn't count on this to be the you know, that the Putin regime will fall sooner than later.
It's the first time, Matt, I've heard the use of Facebook's acquisition strategy as a metaphor for a nation. Tell about what life living these days. It used to be the other way around, perhaps, but the rise of the multinational corporation is back in its way. Prashant, how
it's a sovereign state, you know, so
it is. You know, it's the big world, right? Facebook, billion people and counting. So it's apt, but I may steal it at one point. Because I think it's a nice way to think about it. Is Prashant, you with Susan and Matt, that Putin is going to last as long as Mark Zuckerberg is going to last in controlling the company as well as the country?
I hadn't expected to like compare the longevity of Zuckerberg and Putin's side, but my money on it, I probably would say Zuckerberg because he's still, you know, absurdly young and doesn't have to buy off other plutocrats and sort of oligarchs the way Putin will have to. But no, I think that's exactly right. I think the thing about you know, these recent protests in Russia, it's, you know, I think sometimes we often need a reminder. I say we as the kind of people who watch these things and look from afar of you know, using Putin and Russia as synonymous when in fact Putin happens to be the leader of Russia and he has to make an array of deals. And those deals are never done. They are constantly having to be re-updated, renegotiated, and won once again. I think certainly I fall into this trap, and I think others do too, of thinking of all of Russia's actions domestically and overseas as carefully orchestrated by Putin. And we're constantly trying to think, well, why did he do this? When in fact, similarly, again, to the point I made earlier, you know, sometimes it's just cock up, and sometimes things happen because things happen, and there's a vast bureaucracy, and Russia is an enormous country. And I think that's always a useful reminder to say that, so if and when Putin eventually leaves, you know, the sense of surprise that we often feel when news events happen, I think we should be careful on these things because, in fact, the signs are often there all along. I'm not saying that he's going to leave. I just think we should always be cognizant of the fact that he is not some kind of all-knowing, omniscient, omnipresent leader, even in the way that I would say Xi Jinping is. I would say Xi Jinping has a much greater control over his state than Vladimir Putin does over his. But that's why I find these protests particularly sort of useful as a reminder and as a lesson.
One person who seems to want to help Putin in some way is the President of the United States, who made this quite extraordinary decision to remove as many troops as it could out of Germany, 12,000 troops, most of which, 70%, are being either brought home or deployed further away from the Russian border. The Pentagon has tried to sell this as a necessary way to enhance deterrence of Russia. Not clear that people in Europe are seeing it that way. What are you learning on the reaction to the president's and the administration's decision to withdraw more than a third of the troops that are U.S. troops currently in Germany?
I mean, I think, you know, obviously every president has the right and the obligation to review our military posture overseas, and there could be, and I think presumably it's always tied to some sort of strategic objective. In this case, it's I guess there's always an asterisk to the phrase strategic objective, and Donald Trump is, there's a couple things going on. One, even though he does come from a German family, there's something about Germany that sort of annoys Donald Trump. It has annoyed him since the 80s. I think he was sort of pointing out there's too many Mercedes Benzes driving around New York City. And I think sort of Germany's wealth, that it doesn't spend much on military, that just has been a kind of an itinerant that goes back many years. Angela Merkel, the sort of chancellor of Germany, really annoys Donald Trump. They don't have a good relationship, and that's been the case since probably before he came into office. But it hasn't gone very well. So I think for those couple of reasons, he wants to show that he is punishing Germany for not spending enough on NATO. But if you want to sort of move NATO, and better than all of us, since you served there as the ambassador, there are ways to do that, and there are sort of I think he's gotten a lot of support from the Secretary General of NATO now to try and push the allies to spend more on defense. And the other puzzling thing here is that if you are trying to protect sort of NATO's eastern flank, then most of these troops presumably would be going toward the east. But then again, most of them are going toward the west. He's moving the European headquarters from Stuttgart to Mons in Belgium, and then a lot of the troops are coming home. So it does seem, if you're the Poles, for example, you would think actually this doesn't really help your security, because not only are you drawing down the American presence in Europe, you're not putting troops on the eastern border, and you are at least symbolically doing something that the Kremlin couldn't be more pleased to see, which is not just having fewer American troops in Europe, but really more seeing the Western allies bickering and fighting each other, because the response in Europe has been, this is meant to divide us. This is meant to weaken us. This is another sore point that we have with the Americans and with this president. I just wanted to add one last thing about this, which is that it'll take a long time to move those troops. We've set up essentially cities in Germany where American troops and their families live. It is not that straightforward to move that number somewhere else, because there's so much infrastructure that needs to follow such large numbers. And again, if the election turns out if we have a new president in January, I think this will probably be a moot conversation.
Prashant, the reaction in Europe, I think there was one statement in Europe coming out of Moscow, which thought that this was a wonderful thing, said that the less American troops in Europe, the better. But you're in London. What do you hear in London and in the continent about this move?
Yeah, I think there's, particularly among sort of the national security community and the foreign affairs community, there's, I think, concern, consternation. We can pick whichever word we want. It's, I think the difficulty is with a lot of what the president does, we're aware of his worldview and we're sort of seeing the tactics, but it's kind of unclear how this fits into the strategy of enacting that worldview using these tactics. And so if this is part of his worldview, which we kind of know, right? Like we've known this for 4 years that he's wanted to do something like this. And so it's not surprising. It's more, to some degree, to me, there's a question of how does this fit into that worldview if all you're doing is moving 12,000 troops? If this is if this is your end goal, if this is your great success, then what have you really truly accomplished, except some measure of kind of Russian gloating and strategic sort of loss? That's I think this thing I struggle with. If we want to take him at his word, for what he wanted to do, it's unclear how this fits into that middle bit, the sort of European strategy as time goes on.
Susan, how does it fit in the strategy, and maybe broaden it out a little bit? It seems that the president of the administration is kind of hurrying up and trying to figure out how they can reduce the foreign military presence, not just in Europe, but also in Asia, with a big clash with the Koreans, and of course in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Are we seeing sort of the implementation of the president's worldview in the last 4 months of the first term and maybe last term of Donald Trump?
Yeah, so first of all, I do think there is a big push on to put some facts on the ground on the theory that although some will be reversible if a new administration comes in, it's always better to have facts on the ground than not. And I think that interpretation of this decision is strengthened by the fact that essentially at the same time that this redeployment of forces was announced by the Pentagon, the White House also put through the nomination of a sort of toxic Fox TV talker, Colonel McGregor, to be the new ambassador to Germany, yet another finger in the eye of the Germans. This is someone who essentially has said that, you know, why shouldn't Crimea belong to the Russians, who's been, you know, essentially a kind of thorn in the side of the national security establishment in both parties, really for decades. Actually figures in a difficult way in the Iraq War book I was just reading. So, you know, Trump's determination here, though, I do disagree a little bit with Madame Prashant, only that to call this a strategy is really, really being generous in a way that perhaps actually misrepresents for people what's going on here. We've never had something like this. So I understand that we, you know, I struggle all the time with what's the correct language to frame this in. And the bottom line is the president of the United States has a personal animus toward Germany, the German people, and the chancellor of Germany. It's not that they don't get along well. It's that Donald Trump is jealous of Angela Merkel. He has hated her since before he met her. So it's not like a personal relationship that's gone awry. They're exact polar opposites in temperament. And most importantly, she was on the cover of Time magazine and he wasn't. You know, when he thought he should be the person of the year in 2015, he thinks that, you know, she ruined Germany by letting in a whole bunch of refugees from Syria, and that was part of his appeal and his success in 2016, was attacking her and people like her in the United States. He knows that she was Barack Obama's best friend on the world stage by the time Obama left office, although they too, interestingly, started out having a challenging relationship. And, you know, anything associated with Obama, Donald Trump wants to do the opposite. And, you know, it's still hard to really believe that we could upend so many lives and do something that costs literally billions of dollars and changes the security footprint, because the president of the United States has had a years-long fit of pique, but I can't see any strategic rationale for this. And we have to be honest, even the way that we're talking about this, Donald Trump is publicly claiming, and often he's allowed to get away with it, that this is somehow because Germany isn't paying enough or is delinquent in its bills. As you well know, in fact, Germany made a commitment by 2024, which last I checked is 4 years from now, to spend 2% of its GDP on defense. It probably won't meet that. And there are certainly people in both parties in the United States who think that's a mistake. But Trump is moving the troops to countries not only that are farther away from Russia, but that also do not spend that much of their GDP on defense. So again, like, the absurdity of this conversation is really remarkable. And then a final point just on the troops, because I don't think people necessarily realize this. Many of the US military assets that we have stationed in Germany over the years are there not to protect Germany, as Donald Trump claims, or even necessarily to counter the Russians, although increasingly since the takeover of Crimea, that's the case. AFRICOM, which was a new command established in recent years to focus US attention on the national security threats emanating from Africa. It has its headquarters there. That's now possibly going to be moved. Again, this isn't about Russia or defending Germany. It's an advanced ally and partner that was determined to be sort of a geographic place to station US military assets for responses around the world. Anyways, I'm sorry to go on about this, but it's such a font of, I think it's one of those subjects that tells you so much about how distorted our conversation about geopolitics has become by one person in the last few years. It's really fascinating to me.
I think it's really interesting, if I may just sort of jump in, and I think it's, the semantics, whether what strategy means or not, doesn't mean as aside. If you believe that the world of alliances and the world of sort of institutions set up primarily after World War II is an anachronism that doesn't serve American interests and is too costly. And by the way, there are a lot of people in Europe, above all in Germany, who may even welcome this as well. And in France, by the way, I mean, the French have been trying to have a more quote unquote independent European foreign policy, which was just a code word for a French-led European foreign policy. And there are people in Germany, as you mentioned, that there are Poles who have welcomed the American drawdown and actually do not think Germany should be in some ways tied down in a kind of Western bloc, but should be a sort of independent power in Europe that kind of floats between East and West, and that it's more traditional role. And that's why a lot of people in Germany want very close relationships want a very close relationship with both Russia and China. Then we may be seeing, willy-nilly, obviously, because there is no kind of rational thought or sort of step-by-step strategy, but willy-nilly, a kind of an unraveling slowly of the kind of post-Cold War and the post-war order that we started with Brent Scowcroft, that Brent Scowcroft was so instrumental in upholding and actually rewriting for the post-89 age.
Yeah, I should note, actually, we've just finished our annual opinion polling, the data, and although there continues to be an American view very strongly in favor of NATO, on this particular issue of troop reductions, 73% of Americans either think it is a good decision or it didn't go far enough. It's a small group of people in the United States who think that keeping large numbers in Germany of troops in Germany is a good idea. I think part of it is the debate we've had over the past few years in the way that we've just talked about it, but there is a sense that rich countries should do more on defense. By the way, something I think not only Americans think, presidents back to John F. Kennedy have thought that. So it's not a new issue. Another major, really a new initiative, Prashant, is the signing of an executive order yesterday on TikTok. Some may think that this is all about Trump's anger at the teens and others who are using TikTok to undermine the attendance at his rallies, but there is perhaps a serious strategic rationale as well about the Chinese and the use of data of Chinese apps. What's going on here, and how should we interpret what the administration's move is on this, or the president's move?
Well, I mean, so there were two executive orders, and I think they're both worth paying attention to. One is the executive order on sort of not dealing with TikTok. The other is on WeChat, which is the Tencent sort of WhatsApp on steroids. I think this is actually just utterly fascinating and possibly the most important sort of debate that has to happen in the United States and around the world at the moment, which is, you phrased it earlier to some degree, can decoupling happen and should it happen? And, the president is certainly trying to see if decoupling can happen. And I think it's one of those interesting things where there's not really hard evidence that TikTok leaks data. There's not hard evidence that TikTok can be used as a propaganda tool, has been used as a propaganda tool, though of course it can be, as any kind of social software that way, so if it was so inclined. It's sort of how you want to interpret TikTok really kind of speaks to what is it you see in the Chinese state, and what is your view towards China? It is really a proxy for how we talk about China in so many ways, in that, if you are of the belief that China does not have an independent judiciary, and that Chinese companies, regardless of their headquarters, regardless of their corporate structure, regardless of whether they are governed by American law and owned by American shareholders, if you believe that the Chinese state can reach into America and enforce its own rules extraterritorially, then you believe that TikTok is a threat, effectively. And so it really, when we're talking about TikTok, we're talking about what do we believe China is and what do we believe China will be one day? Because it's not Huawei. Huawei is actually I think, a much less complex problem in that Huawei is hardware. It can be stripped out. There are reasonable competitors. It does not benefit from a network effect the same way a social media network does. Whereas, I mean, Britain has said by 2027, it's going to strip out all Huawei hardware and replace it with Siemens and Nokia, Ericsson and Nokia. And so that's why I think the TikTok decoupling is really, when we talk about it, we're talking about what we believe China will be one day and how we, as a kind of collective, Americans, internationals, everyone should be dealing with it.
Susan, how do you see it? And of course, it should be noted that the Chinese have been doing to TikTok, that is everybody, all our companies, what we're now threatening to do against TikTok. The big Chinese firewall has let American companies on the outside for a very long time. Maybe this is a way to break it open, or is it just the beginning of a decoupling, a technological decoupling, multiple internets, et cetera, that is going forward?
Well, look, I think Prashant makes some really fascinating points. And, there's two issues that are kind of separate, although they're related. One is the sort of short-term politics of it. And, obviously we're dealing with an administration that loves to announce things and make executive orders, and many of them have essentially no effect. Like, remember the recent round of when Twitter decided to kind of Truth Squad one of Trump's tweets, and Trump's response was to, I'm going to sign an executive order that essentially says, well, we should look at the Communications Decency Act. It really didn't have any effect. This is more consequential, but again, the politics are what the politics are, and even people inside his White House probably aren't going to really deny that Donald Trump doesn't know from TikTok, except that these teens seem to have found a way to organize on it and to ordered a whole bunch of tickets to his ill-fated Tulsa rally in a way that embarrassed him and the campaign manager that he soon fired. So that's the politics in the shorter term sense. But I think in the bigger picture sense, Prashant is right that, we're looking at a moment where there's a much broader and actually strategic conversation occurring about decoupling in Washington, as well as in other capitals, European capitals, where there's been more of a wariness about that. As Matt pointed out, there are some in Germany and elsewhere in Europe who actually see themselves as having the opportunity to perform a sort of intermediary or balancing function between China and the United States if we're moving toward a realm of kind of bipolar competition. It's not clear to me yet whether the model that we will settle on is actually that of a sort of Cold War redux with a technology being the main front of competition as opposed to invasions of countries. That is one possibility that's being actively discussed. I do think that it's probably the biggest shift across the board that you've seen in terms of foreign policy thinking in both parties in the last 4 years. Pretty much a widespread recognition in Washington that if the previous mode toward China and to a lesser extent toward Russia was one of making them into responsible stakeholders, of integration into a world system, a US-led world system, at least in Washington's view, but essentially integration into the existing order. I think there are fewer and fewer people who, either Democrats or Republicans, who believe that that's a viable long-term model. And technology, it's pretty obvious, is going to be the sort of arena in which this is litigated. So I do see this as consequential in a way that some of the other more purely election year rhetoric is not.
Matt, final word on your side. Will we look back and say this is the beginning of a fundamental diversion away from cooperating with China to the decoupling that both Prashant and Susan talked about?
I think decoupling is just not really a realistic outcome. The economies are too closely intertwined for that to happen. So you're not going to see a kind of an economic or even a cultural decoupling. Certainly we're seeing a political schism. And I think that's also been going on. This predates TikTok and even Huawei. If you remember that, I see there's actually a lot of consistency in the and it's not an adjective you use often to describe this administration. And if even setting aside some of the bluster of the president and his unique style in sort of carrying out policy and doing foreign policy, there's a consistency that goes back. There was a group of people within the Trump administration who has very firmly held views about China. And they applied those views initially to the world of trade, that we let China into the WTO, we let China into our economic space without enforcing our rules. Essentially, it was a one-way relationship where somehow China took advantage of the open door and never reciprocated. And the pushback against China at the WTO is intended to redress that, whether you agree with that or not. Similarly with technology. Like, why have we let China essentially have a kind of competitor to our tech social media giants rise up when they are locking out our companies from behind the Great Firewall? And so I think they're for the same, and I think the same logic is being applied here as is being applied in the trade disputes. It's not fair. It's time that China started, either they play by our rules or they're not going to be allowed to play at all. And I think this is going to play out. Look, the last point, is this going to continue? I think it's too early to say. You may see a Trump second term say, time for a reset. This is too important economically. We got to get along. And I think you may see similarly a Joe Biden administration come in and look to reset relationships with China. There's a lot of money at stake.
Well, we'll be discussing it one way or the other at World Review in the future. I want to thank all of you for your contribution. Prashant, Matt, Susan, thanks so much for joining us. And thank you for watching. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. In the meantime, thanks all and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.